Let's start here. Discipline built your life. It got you up early. It kept you steady when others drifted. It helped you build skill, income, credibility. It kept you from collapsing when pressure hit. Discipline is honorable. But here's the question most disciplined men never ask. When does discipline stop sharpening you and start shielding you? When does structure become armor? Because armor protects, but it also limits movement. And some of you aren't just disciplined, you're defended. And there's a stark difference here. Discipline says something like, I will do what needs to be done. Armor says, I won't be exposed. Discipline builds consistency, and armor builds rigidity. And rigidity feels strong until it cracks. Here's where it turns, though. You hide inside routines to avoid discomfort. You stay busy so you don't have to reflect. You tighten structure to avoid uncertainty. You grip control to avoid vulnerability. From the outside, nothing looks wrong. You're still performing, but internally, you're tighter, less flexible, less adaptive, less open. And your body knows it. Now, let's get the obvious out of the way. Is control bad? Absolutely not. Control over your effort is strength, but control over variables that aren't yours is just tension. The issue isn't control, it's over control. And let me say the obvious here. Control reduces uncertainty, and your brain is wired to reduce uncertainty. When things feel unpredictable, your nervous system activates. So what do disciplined men do? They tighten up the systems. More planning, more structure, more optimization, more control. Short term, that reduces stress. Long term, it increases internal pressure because the world is not fully controllable. And when reality resists your system, you don't soften, you tighten. That tightening isn't dramatic. It shows up in small ways: shorter patience, lower tolerance for deviation, irritation when plans change, a need for things to go correctly. This isn't personality, it's nervous system rigidity. Flexible systems regulate better. Rigid systems stay braced. And many disciplined men have trained themselves right into rigidity. And you know what? Armor feels safe. That is, until it disconnects you. When discipline becomes armor, you don't delegate easily. You don't reset fully. You don't receive feedback openly. You don't bend, even when bending would be wise. You equate flexibility with weakness, but flexibility is not the opposite of strength. It's a higher form of it. Elite athletes aren't just strong, they're mobile. Resilient fighters aren't just aggressive, they're adaptive. The healthiest nervous systems aren't the calmest, they are the most flexible. They can activate when necessary. They can deactivate when safe. They don't stay braced when there's no threat. That's regulation. That's advanced strength. And here's where it gets real. Armor shows up most certainly in relationships. You're structured, consistent, and dependable. But when challenged, you defend instead of listen. When misunderstood, you correct instead of pause. When things get emotionally messy, you tighten instead of soften. And because you're not yelling, you assume you're handling it well. But your body is locked, and the evidence is written all over it. And other people feel it. Armor protects you from being wrong. It also protects you from being known. That's the trade-off. And this is where most disciplined men get confused. They think tension equals standards. They think rigidity equals leadership. But there's a difference between structure and control. Healthy discipline says, I will control my efforts. Over-control says, I must control the outcome. Healthy discipline says, I will train consistently. Over-control says, if I don't manage everything, something will collapse. Healthy discipline increases capacity. Over-control, though, increases tension. And tension over time becomes identity. You start believing this is just who I am. That's absolutely not. This is who you've trained yourself to be, and training can be adjusted. And here's a principle that's important to understand and learn. You are responsible for stewarding your effort. You are not responsible for dominating every variable. Armor requires perceived threat, and disciplined men rarely admit they feel threatened. Threatened by losing control, threatened by being wrong, threatened by being exposed, threatened by not being needed. So they call it standards. They call it leadership. They call it excellence. Control feels like strength, but sometimes it's just over control. Trust requires strength. Flexibility requires strength. Letting go requires strength. And the research on resilience is clear. The healthiest nervous systems are not defined by constant calm. They are defined by adaptability. They can ramp up when pressure requires it, and they can downshift when safety is present. They don't stay activated unnecessarily. And if you can't downshift, if you can't adapt, if you can't soften, you're just rigid. And rigid systems eventually fracture under enough pressure. Flexible systems, on the other hand, they bend, recover, and continue. That's resilience. So let's bring this home. Where has discipline become defense in your life? Where do you insist on structure because it just feels safe? Where do you resist change because it feels exposing? Where do you tighten instead of adapt? And more importantly, what would it look like to keep your discipline without hiding behind it? That doesn't mean lowering your standards. It means removing fear from underneath them. Because here's the reality. You don't need less discipline. You need better regulation. Advanced strength is not constant tension. It's controlled engagement. It's knowing when to push and when to release. It's knowing when to hold the line and when to pivot. It's being able to say, I don't need to control this, and actually meaning it. And that's not weakness. That's calibrated leadership. And at this point, here's what usually happens. Men hear this, they nod, they agree with some or most of this, then they double down on discipline because it just feels safer. But if you want to operate at a higher level without isolating yourself, without carrying invisible tension, without confusing control for strength, you have to train flexibility. You have to practice releasing outcomes. You have to let someone else carry what is theirs. And that requires humility. Most men will hear this and tighten. A few will hear it and recalibrate. Which one are you?